Well, if you look at this statement, it's certainly extensive in nature, and there's a lot to unpack. So let's start from the very top. At the forefront, both Presidents Putin and Trump expressed a joint commitment to defeat Daesh, and they expressed a level of satisfaction that the enhanced cooperation and deconfliction, as this joint communique refers it, by the U.S. military and the Russian military over the Syrian battlefield has been working in the fight against Daesh. So that's one. Number two, they were focusing on the Geneva peace process. So this joint communique, what was so interesting about it was that it specifically pointed to the current Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, the Assad regime, and it held the Assad regime accountable to the Geneva peace process and the political transition that's agreed upon by the United Nations, that's ensconced in this process. This calls for constitutional reform. This calls for eventual free and fair elections that will be monitored by international monitors, and that would be an extraordinary step towards moving Syria away from the violence and towards some sort of political settlement. And lastly, there was also a focus in this joint communique on establishing a ceasefire in parts of Syria and southern Syria, and establishing de-escalation, continuing the de-escalation process. Not a full ceasefire, but a de-escalation of the fighting in northern Syria and parts of northeastern Syria, and allowing unrestricted humanitarian access to all parts of Syria. Now, as this statement, this joint communique, was being released by the Americans and by the Russians, if you look at, we also have to look at what's happening on the ground in Syria at the same time. There are still children that are starving to death in eastern Ghouta, which is a suburb of Damascus. Just imagine, just barely 10 miles away from the Republican palace, from the presidential palace in Damascus, you have children starving to death. We're seeing some horrific images that are being smuggled out by Syrian activists in Syria. So clearly, there's still a long ways to go in Syria. There's clearly a problem with humanitarian aid and humanitarian access getting to the people that need it, getting to the children, to the civilians that are still trapped and besieged by the Assad regime's forces. And there are, of course, still major questions on whether or not Bashar al-Assad would hold free and fair elections and reform the country and the constitution. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but this statement by President Putin and by President Trump is hopefully will lay the foundation to move forward.